Headlines like this one tend to imply the worst, that a beloved star has passed away, leaving grieving relatives behind. So let's clear the air immediately. As of 2026, Don Johnson is alive, working, and by most credible financial estimates, worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 million. What actually makes his family cry isn't a funeral. It's the weight of everything he built, fought for, and nearly lost along the way. A story that includes a courtroom battle most people have never heard the full details of, and a family legacy that has quietly grown into one of Hollywood's more remarkable dynasties. This is that story. Long before anyone associated the name Don Johnson with pastel blazers and speedboats, he was just Donnie Wayne Johnson, born December 15, 1949, in the small farming community of Flat Creek, Missouri. His mother, Nell, worked as a beautician. His father, Wayne, farmed the land. It was a modest, unglamorous upbringing in the Ozarks, and nothing about it pointed toward Hollywood stardom. The family later relocated to Wichita, Kansas, where Johnson's parents eventually divorced when he was a teenager. Those years were turbulent. By his own accounts in later interviews, he ran with a rough crowd and had brushes with the law as a young teenager, including an arrest connected to a stolen car that landed him in a juvenile facility for a time. None of that suggested a future built on ownership rights, courtroom victories, or a Golden Globe. What actually redirected his life was a high school drama class and a starring role in production of West Side Story at Wichita South High School. Something clicked. He went on to study theater at the University of Kansas on scholarship, but left after a year for a more serious opportunity, a spot at the American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco. From there, his professional stage debut came in 1969, playing a role in an off-Broadway production of the prison drama Fortune and Men's Eyes, a gritty, unglamorous starting point for a man who would later become synonymous with glamour itself. Through the early 1970s, Johnson worked steadily but without a major breakthrough. Small film roles, television guest spots. According to his own recollections, he auditioned for and was rejected from 5 separate NBC pilots. By his early 30s, 2 brief marriages had already ended. It was not, by any measure, the resume of a future icon. That changed in 1984, when Johnson was cast as Detective James Sonny Crockett in Miami Vice, the Michael Mann-produced NBC series that reshaped how television looked, sounded, and dressed. The pastel suits, the 5 o'clock shadow, the Ferrari, the houseboat. Crockett became one of the defining images of 1980s pop culture, and Johnson became a genuine phenomenon almost overnight. He won a Golden Globe for Best Actor in a television series drama, and picked up an Emmy nomination, and the show's reach extended his image into fashion, music, and advertising. But Johnson also showed, early on, that he understood something many stars of his era did not: leverage. Between the 2nd and 3rd seasons of Miami Vice, he staged a well-documented holdout over pay, reportedly seeking a jump from around $30,000 an episode into 6 figures. He didn't get everything he asked for. He returned at a reported $60,000 plus per episode, but he proved a point that would matter enormously a decade later. He knew what his work was worth, and he was willing to walk away to prove it. At the height of Miami Vice fever, Johnson expanded well beyond acting. In 1986, he released a pop album Heartbeat on Epic Records. Its title track climbed to number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100, and the album went gold. Site index equals 11-1. Heartbeat was certified gold by the Recording Industry Association of America in November 1986, and its title track reached number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart/site. He followed it with second album Let It Roll in 1989. He also poured money and time into competitive offshore powerboat racing, a genuinely dangerous pursuit that had nothing to do with his day job and everything to do with a restless, competitive personality. Miami Vice wrapped in 1989, and Hollywood assumed a dominant film career would naturally follow. It didn't happen quite that way. Films like Harley Davidson and The Marlboro Man and Born Yesterday did not replicate the show's cultural shockwave, and by the early 1990s, Johnson found himself in a noticeably quieter professional stretch. That quiet stretch is where the Don Johnson went broke narrative took root, and it's worth being honest about how much of it was invention versus fact. A slower career is not the same thing as financial ruin, but tabloids of that era were not in the business of nuance. A star cooling off after a decade at the absolute center of pop culture became, in gossip retellings, a star who had lost it all. It was a tidier story than the truth, and it stuck around for years, resurfacing periodically even decades later in recycled online content. What the rumor mill missed almost entirely was what Johnson was doing behind the scenes, negotiating one of the more unusual ownership deals in 1990s network television. In 1996, Johnson returned to series television as Inspector Nash Bridges on the CBS drama Nash Bridges, opposite Cheech Marin. The show wasn't as culturally explosive as Miami Vice, but was steady, it was profitable, and, most importantly, Johnson had structured his 1995 contract with unusual foresight. If the series ran beyond 66 episodes, Johnson would receive a 50% copyright ownership stake in the show itself, not just a salary. It was, by industry accounts, an unusually generous arrangement for a working actor to secure. Nash Bridges ran for 6 seasons and 122 episodes, nearly double the threshold in his contract, which meant the ownership provision kicked in fully. The show went on to air in dozens of countries, generating years of syndication and licensing revenue. On paper, Johnson wasn't just a lead actor collecting a check anymore. He was a co-owner of valuable, ongoing intellectual property. Then came the fight. The show's production company, Risher Entertainment, argued that after production and distribution costs, Nash Bridges had actually lost money. Site index equals 1-1. Risher maintained that the series was a very expensive show to produce, and that Nash Bridges was $40 million in the red/site, which, in their accounting, meant there were no profits for Johnson to claim a share of. It's a defense with a long, well-documented history in Hollywood. A show can air worldwide for years and still appear, through studio bookkeeping, to have never turned a dime. Johnson's legal team didn't buy it. In February 2009, Johnson's production company sued Risher Entertainment, along with 2929 Entertainment and Quelia Capital, over unpaid profits. Site index equals 8-1. He sued 3 entertainment companies, Risher Entertainment, 2929 Entertainment, and Quelia Capital. In February 2009/site, the case went to trial in the summer of 2010. After 2 weeks of testimony, a Los Angeles jury sided decisively with Johnson. Site index equals 6-1. The jury verdict requires Risher Entertainment to pay Don Johnson Production $23.2 million in damages and recognize him as co-owner of Nash Bridges/site. Speaking outside the courtroom afterward, Johnson framed the win in personal terms. Site index equals 8-1. It was my idea and I own the rights in the first place, Johnson said in a statement. From the beginning, I've asked only that Risher honor our contract, and I am so pleased that the jury agreed with me. /site. The trial judge then added prejudgment interest to the award, which puts the total value dramatically higher, reportedly into the neighborhood of $50 million at its peak. Site index equals 3-1. The jury awarded Johnson $23.2 million in damages, and the trial court awarded an additional $29.1 million in prejudgment interest /site. It looked, for a moment, like one of the more decisive individual victories any actor had won against the studio in years. But the story wasn't finished. Risher appealed, and in 2012 the California appellate court found that the jury had miscalculated the interest portion of the award. Site index equals 3-1. The Court of Appeal accepted the argument that the jury committed misconduct when, after determining that Johnson's damages were $15 million, the jurors agreed to increase the award by adding on $8.3 million of prejudgment interest that was calculated improperly /site. The court upheld Johnson's underlying win and his ownership status, but slashed the total dollar figure significantly, cutting the overall award down toward roughly $15 million plus a more modest, correctly calculated interest amount. Site index equals 7-1. The court affirmed a $15 million damage award plus 10% interest on that sum from July 12, 2010 /site. The case finally settled in January 2013. Risher wired Johnson Production Company $19 million to close the matter for good. Site index equals 5-1. Lawyers for the two sides finally resolved the dispute with Risher, wiring $19 million to Johnson's Production Company /site. It was a smaller number than the headline-grabbing figure from 2010, but confirmed permanently and legally what Johnson had argued from the beginning. He wasn't just an actor who'd been well paid for a TV show. He was a rightful co-owner of it. By the time the Nash Bridges case wrapped up, Johnson was in his 60s, an age where Hollywood narratives usually start writing someone out a story. Instead, the opposite happened. Quentin Tarantino cast him as Big Daddy in Django Unchained, 2012. He followed with Cold in July, 2014, then found an entirely new generation of fans through his role as a smug, entitled Richard Drysdale in Rian. Johnson's Knives Out, 2019. HBO's Watchmen cast him as Chief Judd Crawford, a role built around authority and buried secrets. More recently, he took on a lead role as Captain Robert Massey in ABC's Doc Odyssey in 2024, and appeared that same year in Netflix's Rebel Ridge. None of that reads like the resume of a man the tabloids once wrote off as finished. It reads like an actor who kept working, kept getting cast by serious filmmakers, and kept proving the same way he did in that Los Angeles courtroom. That being counted out and actually being out are two very different things. As for the number people are most curious about, multiple financial tracking outlets placed Don Johnson's net worth in 2026 at approximately $50 million. Site index equals 11-1. Don Johnson is an American actor, director, producer, and singer-songwriter who has a net worth of $50 million/site, built from decades of television salaries, the Nash Bridges settlement, music royalties, real estate, and continued acting work. It's worth noting, as with any celebrity net worth estimate, that these figures are informed approximations rather than verified public record. Private contracts and settlements are rarely disclosed in full, but the consistency across independent estimates, all landing in a similar range, supports the broader point. The Don Johnson is broke narrative that tabloids pushed decades ago simply does not hold up. Still, if you're looking for what actually makes his family cry in the emotional sense the title implies, it isn't a dollar figure. It's the family itself. Johnson's romantic history is genuinely tangled up with Hollywood lineage. He first met actress Melanie Griffith, daughter of Tippi Hedren, in 1972, when Griffith was a teenager, and the two were briefly married in 1976 before divorcing within a year. Johnson went on to marry actress Patty D'Arbanville in 1981. They had a son, Jesse Johnson, born in 1982, before that marriage also ended. Johnson and Griffith reconnected years later, remarrying in 1989. 9 months into that reunion, their daughter, Dakota Johnson, was born on October 4th, 1989, a birth that quietly tied two well-known Hollywood family lines together decades before anyone knew how significant it would become. Johnson and Griffith divorced again in 1994. In 1999, Johnson married Kelly Flager, a San Francisco area schoolteacher, in a ceremony held at the Pacific Heights estate of Ann and Gordon Getty. Famously, some guests reportedly thought they were arriving for an ordinary dinner party. That marriage has lasted more than 2 decades, and together Johnson and Flager had 3 more children, daughter Atherton Grace and sons Jasper and Deacon, bringing his total to 5 children across his relationships. That's the actual family side of the story, and it's a more interesting one than any inheritance headline could capture. Jesse Johnson built his own acting career. Atherton, Jasper, and Deacon largely grew up outside the harshest glare of tabloid attention, a choice that says something about the kind of privacy Johnson and Flager tried to protect for their kids. And then there's Dakota, who grew into one of the most recognizable actresses of her generation, first through the 50 Shades franchise and later through critically respected work that established her as far more than a famous surname. There's a familiar internet pattern at play with content like this. Take a famous man once defined by extravagance, the cars, the boats, the pastel suits, and eventually turn him into either a cautionary tale about lost fortune or, in more clickbait-driven cases, imply an ending that hasn't actually happened. Neither version fits Don Johnson's actual story particularly well. The man did not go broke after Miami Vice. He hit a slower professional patch, like most actors eventually do, and the gossip machine exaggerated into something closer to collapse, because collapse is a more shareable story than his career cooled off for a few years. He did not lose everything in some hidden scandal. He fought a studio in open court, in front of a jury, over a contract he had the foresight to negotiate a decade earlier, and he won, even after the appellate process trimmed the final number down. And he is not, as of this writing, gone. He's in his mid-70s, still taking roles from serious filmmakers, still married, and still, by every available account, actively working. What actually deserves the word fortune here isn't just the estimated $50 million. It's a career built twice. First on raw charisma in the 1980s, then on hard-won ownership and legal recognition in the 2000s and 2010s. Plus a family that spans 5 children, 2 of Hollywood's more storied bloodlines, and a daughter who became a major star in her own right, entirely outside her father's shadow. That's not a story that ends in a courtroom, a settlement check, or a tabloid headline. It's a story about a kid from a small Missouri town who learned, the hard way and more than once, that being counted out is not the same thing as being finished, and who built something durable enough that it's still standing and still growing decades after the pastel suits went out of style.